Hi, this is Emerald and welcome to the Diamond Net, and today I'm going to be talking to you about how to integrate the feminine. Alright, so this video is all about how to integrate the feminine side, and basically this video is for everyone regardless of gender. It's not specifically tailored to women or tailored to men or anything like that. It's just about being able to be in touch with the archetypal feminine and the energetic feminine by dropping resistance to them. And ultimately, this video is meant to serve a person's general sense of wholeness within themselves. If we polarize into one of our energies or the other, what happens is we start to deny parts of ourself that are associated with the opposite energy from that which we're trying to identify with. And so basically what we're trying to do here is we're trying to drop resistance to the feminine in particular, and I'll do a video about the masculine in the future. We were trying to drop resistance to the archetypal and energetic feminine so that we can become more whole in ourselves. So when thinking about the masculine and feminine, we want to think about it a bit like an infinity symbol. So basically on one side of the infinity symbol, we have the feminine, and on the other pole, we have the masculine. And so when it's the case that, let's say, these two energies are accepted fully within ourselves and integrated, we get this kind of nice connection happening between those two polarities. And this creates a lot of growth relative to both of the polarities. And so if you can imagine, it's sort of like we have to do a full circuit in order to go up a level with it, then ultimately, in order to have that sense of growth and to have individuation relative to the masculine and feminine, we have to drop resistance to both polarities. And so ultimately allowing ourselves to be exactly how we are without kind of keeping ourselves in a little box that's labeled, this is the masculine, this is the feminine. We have to allow both of these energies within us. And this is what allows us to become more whole and integrated within ourselves and allows us to individuate and grow more. And if you don't integrate the feminine, the masculine side stagnates. If you don't integrate the masculine side, the feminine side stagnates. So both of these function like two sides to one coin, and if we have resistance to one, we're going to develop issues with the other. Now when it comes to the way that I'm using the words masculine and feminine, I think it's really important for me to draw some distinctions. So basically we have the cultural masculine and cultural feminine, which are, qualities that are generally ascribed to men and women within a given culture. So for example, like the idea that women wear pink can be part of the cultural feminine, or that men are associated with, let's say, stoicism or something like that. So basically, like, it's the idea of what is woman-like or man-like in a given culture, which has some variation between cultures. And then we have the archetypal and the energetic masculine and feminine. So basically, the energetic masculine and feminine is yin, which is associated with the feminine, and yang, that's associated with the masculine. And so we can kind of think of yin as like the being nature and yang as the doing nature. And of course, we all have yin and yang. Every living and non-living system has both of these things and interplay with one another. And basically, yin and yang is also encapsulated in a lot of different archetypal symbols that are associated with the masculine and the feminine. And so what we're going to be doing is we're going to be kind of putting like the idea of the cultural feminine and masculine to the side, because we're not really talking about something that relates heavily to gender, even though it sounds like it does. What we're talking about is we're talking about integrating the natural energies and polarities within ourselves. Now, this particular video has to do with the integration of the archetypal and energetic feminine, but I'm also going to make a video in the future about how to integrate the archetypal and energetic masculine as well. But when it comes to integration of either one of these energies, what integration essentially deals with is dropping resistance to whatever it happens to be. And oftentimes these resistances can be something that we're not consciously aware of. And so sometimes it can be very, very helpful to be able to pinpoint out certain traits that are associated with the archetypal and energetic feminine so that we can start to be like, oh, I have a resistance to this trait. I need to work through that resistance so I can come to accept and love and express this part of myself. So basically, it doesn't mean putting on femininity from the outside or starting to behave in more feminine ways, but especially not in the way that we conceptualize of the cultural feminine. But ultimately, it's about being able to take away our resistances internally to the feminine, not trying to, let's say, match up to certain standards and rules associated with the feminine that, oh, the feminine is this, the feminine is that, so I'm going to become that. It's more like, oh, the feminine is associated with these things, and I see that I have a resistance to X, Y, and Z quality in the list of archetypal feminine traits. So let me figure out where that resistance is, and let me see if I can drop that resistance. So whatever happens to be naturally in me that is feminine can exist there without being stifled and stagnant. So our goal here is to own whatever happens to be there. So in this video, I'm going to be mentioning 11 different things that are associated with the archetypal and energetic feminine that we're going to be trying to drop resistance to. All right, so when I bring up the feminine principled qualities, I'm also going to bring them up in relation to their masculine principled counterpart. So the very first quality that I'm going to be talking about is the quality of limitation, which is the feminine principled quality, versus the masculine principled quality of unlimitedness. Now, oftentimes, there's a strong value that we place on things that are unlimited. We don't really like the sense of limitation, and we look at limitation as though it's a hindrance, and limitation in its negative form certainly can be, but limitation also is it's very important and very helpful. Ultimately, limitation can bring with it a lot of meaning, and ultimately every single one of us in this sense are feminine principled beings, because we have a birth and we have a death, we have a life cycle. Ultimately, when it comes to something that is infinite, it has to be very abstract and very out there and very lofty because of that abstractness. But basically everything that has a beginning and an end is feminine principled in that sense. Now, like I had said before, limitation is something that allows us to experience meaning. If we had a life that stretched on forever this way and would keep going on forever that way, it would be very hard for us to be able to derive meaning out of a life that goes on forever. But it's the fact that we are born and then we experience our lifespan and we have lots of different experiences within this finite amount of time, and that we end one day, that what's going on right now has meaning. It's in the same way that a story has meaning because it has a beginning and end, or a game has meaning in that it has a beginning and an end. So for example, if I take a game like tic-tac-toe, ultimately it's the fact that there's only 9 squares to fill in that gives a kind of container around the game to where someone could potentially win the game. Ultimately, if I had infinite tic-tac-toe squares, ultimately that game wouldn't really mean anything, because it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It can keep stretching on forever and ever. And so you could never determine who a winner is or anything like that until you put the limitations of some kind of rule. So ultimately, when it comes to deriving meaning, we have to be able to look through the lens of limitation to do so. Or another example as to why limitation is important is, like, let's say in the world of video games, there's basically, like, let's say certain characters and everything that you can play, certain avatars. And sometimes there'll be complaints about certain ones of these avatars being overpowered because it makes it too easy to beat the game. And so it's very much the limitation of the avatar that allows us to derive some kind of meaning from winning the game. It allows us to enjoy the gameplay as opposed to feeling like everything is too easy for us to beat. And so whenever it's the case that we have limitation, we can have a certain type of enjoyment, and we can have a certain, we can have basically barriers to kind of push back against in some way. And we also have to practice limitation in order to focus on something. We have to be able to pinpoint what we're going to focus on, and then we're going to have to eliminate the rest. So if we keep infinite possibilities stretching on in every direction, then we're never going to be able to choose a deep path. And so limitation oftentimes has to do with, let's say, negating the breadth of so many things to be able to move deeper into the depth of something. And also another good thing with limitation is that even when things go really bad and we're experiencing intense amounts of suffering, well, it's always the case that this too shall pass, because ultimately no suffering lasts forever. It has limitation. So that was the first feminine principle trait of limitation. The second feminine principle trait is ordinariness, which is in contrast to the masculine counterpart of extraordinariness. Now, societally, we tend to look at that which is ordinary as less than that which is extraordinary. So we tend to put a high value on things being unique and interesting and, something that's excellent in some particular type of way. But ultimately, the ordinary is where a lot of the magic happens. So when we can be ordinary with other people, this is the point where we can have connection. Whereas if we try to seek connection through extraordinariness, it kind of takes the form of us, let's say, trying to be very admirable and to get some kind of kudos from other people. And ultimately, this creates a kind of situation where it's good for us in one way, but it doesn't really create that sense of connection. So if we go looking for connection through our sense of excellence and extraordinariness, what's going to happen is we're going to be in a lot of situations like this where there's just not the ability to connect eye to eye. But if we are able to see ourselves as an ordinary person interacting with other ordinary people, this is where we get that sense of connection happening. And so with ordinariness, it's about being able to recognize yourself as an average part of what is. So there's this sense of connection with reality and with other people that come along with the acceptance of ordinariness. So I like to think about it this way. So as somebody who has typically polarized into extraordinariness throughout my entire life as a means of coping, the way that I could describe it is it's a little bit like when we go into extraordinariness and polarize away and push away ordinariness and we reject ordinariness, what happens is that we become almost like, let's say, a puzzle piece that comes separate from the rest of the puzzle. So let's say that the puzzle is laid out here and we as the puzzle piece want to stand out, let's say, compared to others, in some hierarchical way. Well, ultimately, if we're only conceptualizing of ourselves that way and we're rejecting our ordinariness, it's that sense of disjointedness and disconnection, and it makes us feel all alone in the universe. Whereas if we can accept both our extraordinariness and ordinariness at once, it's like we can still hold on to the ways that we're good at things and extraordinary at things, but then we get to be the puzzle piece that gets reconnected with the rest of the puzzle. And now we start to feel like we are part of nature and that we are part of the universe and that we're connected with other people. So ordinariness is absolutely required for connection, and connection is something that's also within the feminine principle as well. Now, one of the reasons why we tend to reject ordinariness and polarize into extraordinariness is because we experience some kind of shame. And we feel like in order to be valid, we have to prove ourselves special and prove ourselves worthy by showing that we can do this and be that way. And so oftentimes it can be a way of avoiding the feelings of shame. So oftentimes ordinariness has a lot of shame to it, making it very difficult to integrate this particular feminine quality. Now, I wanted to give a quick note here because I had forgotten to mention this earlier. Ultimately, let's say, especially for somebody who identifies with femininity or womanhood, even though this isn't specifically relating to gender, oftentimes this can show us the ways that we might have resistances to things. So basically, let's say if I run across this in a video and I say, okay, well, ordinariness is associated with the feminine, and let's say the masculine is associated with extraordinariness, or let's say limitation is associated with the feminine and unlimitedness is associated with the masculine. Well, ultimately, if I kind of construe that or make the connection of gender and I relate to it that way and I start to feel upset that the feminine quality, principal quality is ordinariness and limitation, then this can show me that I have some resistances to these qualities because I'm seeing limitation as, let's say, less than unlimitedness, or I'm seeing ordinariness as less than extraordinariness. But oftentimes this comes from being conditioned in a society that values one of those qualities over the other. And so basically, if you find yourself experiencing that kind of resistance, or even on the opposite side, let's say if I'm a man and I'm looking through the video and I'm going like, oh yes, like unlimitedness is associated with the masculine, extraordinariness is associated with the masculine, yes. If I find myself having either of those two responses, then that can be something to look into. So basically, if we've polarized into the masculine to the exclusion of the feminine, then this can be somewhat of the response that we might have here, because we start to see one is better than the other when really they're meant to come together in a yin and yang sort of relationship and are really truly on the same platform as one another, just having different types of qualities. So if you notice yourself in the past two examples, or even in future examples, having this kind of polarized reaction to it, whether it be kind of the resistance or the kind of celebration, either way, it can be an indication that there's a resistance to the feminine that's there. So that's something to pay attention to as well. All right, the next feminine principled trait to integrate is vulnerability, which exists in relation to its masculine counterpart of impermeability. So that which is vulnerable is able to receive. It's soft. It's something that is more permeable. And so in order for us to learn and take in things from the outside world, we have to in some ways open ourselves up and make ourselves more receptive, more vulnerable in that way. Now, with, let's say, impermeability, basically it's kind of like putting up a shield. And sometimes it's the right time to put up a shield, but it can keep away so much that we would otherwise be receptive to. Now, being in touch with vulnerability can be very, very difficult, because if we put ourselves out there in our vulnerable state, how can we guarantee that somebody's not going to take advantage of that vulnerability or hit us where it hurts? And so oftentimes we'll resist this feminine principled trait for that reason. And so when it comes to that vulnerability, we want to make sure that we are in a safe space when we express it, but we have to allow ourselves to accept this part of ourselves. Oftentimes vulnerability can be associated with a lot of negative things like weakness and cowardice and other things like this. And so we don't want to associate vulnerability with this, because vulnerability is actually truly a strength. It enables us to be receptive, and it enables us to be we're able to be softer, and so we're able to connect more deeply with other things. So let's say if we think about, let's say, impermeability as being shieldedness or guardedness, we kind of have a certain type of armor on ourselves. Whereas if we're more vulnerable, we put ourselves more out there as like a gelatinous blob, in some way. And so we can take in more from the outside. And let's say when it comes to intimacy, when it comes to being able to connect deeply with another person and to be seen by another person and to see that person, it requires us to both be kind of gelatinous blobs together and to kind of mesh together. And so basically, like, in order to have that sense of connection, like ordinariness, we need to have a sense of vulnerability. And so basically, vulnerability and ordinariness are necessary, both necessary for the feminine principled quality of connection. One way to get into a sense of not knowing that's very, very relevant to consciousness work is to be in touch with our sense of not knowing. Ultimately, human beings are always in this big epistemological blind spot where we can never know anything beyond a shadow of a doubt. And that's a vulnerable thing to admit, that ultimately we don't really know very much about what's going on in the universe at all. We have a very, very limited spectrum of knowledge, and we're so small in comparison to the rest of the universe. And so if we can humble ourselves, which is part of the ordinariness and also part of the vulnerability, and ultimately we can then open ourselves up to new knowing by recognizing our standpoint of not knowing. And so that often is a very vulnerable thing to do as well. All right, so the next feminine principled quality that we're going to be exploring is the body and the instincts. And this exists in relation to the masculine principled polarity of the mind. So with this, the body is the feminine and the mind is the masculine. And so you can tell a lot about your connection to the feminine by looking at your relationship to your body. Do you think about your body primarily in an aesthetic way, where you think about how do I look to other people? Do you have a lot of insecurities about the body, where maybe you're always working out at the gym or trying to lose weight because it's hard to accept yourself as you are? Or do you find yourself looking in the mirror and scrutinizing yourself? Or do you find yourself hiding away up in the mind and totally neglecting the body and disassociating from the body? All of these things can be a strong litmus test for how connected to the feminine you are or that you aren't. And in relation to this, one of the experiences that I had in a medicine ceremony that I participated in this past year is that I basically became the feminine itself. And so my relationship to my body that I usually have, which isn't always the best relationship, I realized was actually like reflected into me from humanity's relationship to the earth, but also that my relationship to my body was actually impacting that whole, the whole of humanity's relationship to the earth. And so it can be really, really important to be able to get a good relationship to your body, and to look at it more so in a way where you can exercise a deep gratitude for the things that your body does for you. All right, so the next feminine principled quality that I'm going to be exploring is collectivism, which exists in relation to its masculine counterpart, individualism. Now, I personally was raised in a very individualistic environment that praised individualism quite a lot. And so I grew up really thinking about individualism as a kind of unquestioned good. And I'm glad for it. I mean, it shaped me in a particular way. But one of the things I realized is that it polarized me also at the same time away from this feminine principled quality of collectivism. And it's only in recent years that I've started to be able to integrate the other side of the spectrum. Now, as I had mentioned before, the feminine has a lot to do with connection and relating. So again, within the ordinariness, it's that very eye-to-eye connection. It's the vulnerability in being able to connect to different things. So basically, with that sense of connection, ultimately collectivism has a lot to do with that. It comes about, let's say, seeing ourselves through the lens of, let's say, not just being an individual person, but as a person who belongs to a particular group or a particular species. And so we can kind of look at collectivism through that lens. So I like to think about individualism as being more based off of self-preservation, whereas collectivism is more based off of species preservation. Now, if we polarize ourselves too far into species preservation, what's going to happen is that we're going to totally lose sense of ourselves, and we're going to start only serving other people, which of course is not something that we want to do. So there can be a kind of possessive element to the feminine within this. So we don't want to fall into, let's say, getting caught up with the caregiver archetype and, let's say, only giving care to other people and sacrificing ourselves. So that's a caveat that I would mention here. But when it comes to integrating the collectivist element of the feminine, it really has to do with our ability to conceptualize of ourself as a part of a deeper whole. So for example, if we look at the tree, do we only see the tree, or do we recognize that it belongs within a greater ecosystem? So it's the sense of like the parts belong to a greater whole, and that the behaviors of the parts are also contingent upon what's going on with that greater whole. So let's say, for example, if we take somebody who is putting on like a nature documentary, and they're hosting this nature documentary and they're talking about capybaras or something like that. Well, ultimately, they're not going to be looking at each capybara as an individual, but they're going to be exploring them in relation to the greater whole of their species and the way that this species tends to eat and interact, and just different types of maybe capybara related behaviors that come up. Well, ultimately, the question is, can you look at humanity as the way that the nature show documentarian is looking at the capybaras? Can you recognize your humanity as part of a greater whole, and that you've been shaped by the forces within humanity as well as you do the shaping of the forces within humanity? All right, so the next feminine principled quality that I'm going to be talking about is groundedness, with its masculine counterpart of loftiness. Now, loftiness tends to have to do with things that are more abstract, being philosophical, thinking about the future, thinking about the past, thinking, basically is a big part of the masculine principle. And so it has to do with things that are intangible. Now, when it comes to do with grounding, it has to do with getting in touch with the sensory experiences and that which is tangible. So the feminine principle principle has to do with that which is down to earth, and we even call the earth Mother Earth for a reason. And even words like matter are rooting down to similar root words to mother. So, things like matter, maternal, matrix are relating to words like matter and material. That's no coincidence. In fact, in Hungarian, my husband is Hungarian, the word for matter in Hungarian is anyag, and the word for mother is anya. So there's a strong connection between the feminine principle and that which is of the material world. And so when it comes to grounding, grounding has to do with being able to connect with the material world through your sensory experiences. Now, the next quality of the feminine to be integrated is being, with its masculine counterpart of doing. Now, this is one that a lot of people tend to polarize into the masculine with. We tend to conceptualize of ourselves fundamentally as human doings as opposed to human beings. And so we will think about the validity of our existence and our worthiness to be here, oftentimes through the things that we're doing. And we'll try to prove ourselves worthy by achieving this and doing that. But ultimately, when it comes to being able to really connect with the very validity of our being, we have to do it from the standpoint of ordinariness, where we can see ourselves on the same plane as everything else in existence, where we realize in the same way that stars just are, and trees just are, and different animals, and even, let's say, caterpillars out in the bush just are. Ultimately, for us, we just are also. And so with that isness, that has to do with connecting to the feminine principled quality of being. And so when it comes to being, it can be very, very difficult for us to see the value in being. We're used to seeing the value in doing and in things that have function and utility, but we don't often recognize the value and the validity in being. Now, we have another masculine feminine polarity here that comes into play. So we have beauty versus utility. It's not one that's on my list, but it's one that's there, and it very much relates to being. Being relates to beauty, and then doing relates to utility and functionality. And we're used to functioning through the lens of, oh, things exist because they have some kind of functionality. Even if we're looking at things through the lens of like aesthetic, kind of components, we go, oh, well, that's valuable because it makes the space more beautiful. Or a pretty face is valuable because it's like, it means that, it means childbearing features, or, we tend to look at beauty through the lens of utility and this type of thing. But on the other side, we have beauty, which exists in this sublime space of just recognizing the inherent isness of what is. And when we're faced with beauty like that, which can come from unconventional places, we ultimately recognize the unshakable validity of that which is based off of being instead of off of doing and serving some other function in relation to something else. So with the polarity of doing and utility, it all has to do with serving some other end. So it's like I can validate the existence of this thing because it exists to serve some other thing. And I can validate the existence of that thing because it exists to serve another thing. Whereas on the other polarity of beauty and being, it is the end. It is what is. So basically it's to question, why does the universe exist? Well, it exists because it exists, and it doesn't have to serve some other end to validate its existence. It doesn't have to have some kind of functionality. It simply is. Now, the feminine principled polarity of being can be a little bit difficult to explain in ways that gets the meaning across, because that which is just sounds like a tautology. But ultimately, that which is a very profound statement. And the fact that something's existence doesn't have to serve something else's existence to be valid is there within the polarity of being and beauty. All right, so the next quality of the feminine that I'm going to be discussing is cycles versus the masculine principled quality of forward movement. And so when it comes to forward movement is really functioning like we have this goal and we're trying to get to the destination. So it's very product oriented. And so if you can imagine, it's like life is like climbing a mountain. And then it's the sense that somewhere off in the future, we're going to reach the peak. We're going to reach the summit of that mountain. And so that's what forward movement is about. Now, cycles are kind of like the seasons. So basically, it's kind of like it's spring, it's summer, it's fall, it's winter, and then it's spring again. So it's a bit more like a merry-go-round. So it's almost like, let's say if life is a playground and it's like, okay, I'm going to go on the merry-go-round for a while, and I'm going to appreciate that, and I'm going to go on the swings for a while, and I'm going to appreciate that, and I'm going to go on the slide for a while, and I'm going to appreciate that. So it's really about just enjoyment, being in the moment, and it's not about getting to any particular place. Now, what's really common is for us to start conceptualizing of ourselves through the forward movement kind of way of thinking about things. So it's like, okay, I'm going to achieve this, which is going to enable me to achieve that, which is going to enable me to achieve this other thing, and so on and so on and so on. And what can be kind of happening underneath the surface is that a person, even though they might not consciously think that, unconsciously holds the idea that life is going to stretch on forever. And so it's this sense of like, oh, I'm just going to expand infinitely forever and ever. I'm going to keep achieving. I'm going to keep overcoming it. I'm going to keep moving past. And so oftentimes, if a person holds this paradigm where they've rejected the feminine principled quality of cycles or haven't yet integrated, and they've polarized themselves into expansion and forward movement and doing, what happens is that once that person gets to the point where the finish line is in sight, and yet they haven't reached the summit of that mountain, because ultimately the summit of the mountain is death itself, ultimately it's going to create this kind of existential crisis where they go, oh gosh, then what's been the point of my life if I've just been doing all of these things to eventually have it all end? And so if we can integrate the feminine principled quality that children tend to integrate quite well, we think about reality as more something to experience in the moment, something that we can really just enjoy. And ultimately, life itself is a cycle, and it's a cycle that has many cycles within it. And ultimately, those cycles don't have a final destination. And so can you accept that life is a cycle that doesn't go anywhere specific? It doesn't serve some other end. It just is. Now, a great metaphor for this integration of the masculine and feminine with regard to cycles and forward movement is seen within the myth of Sisyphus, where Sisyphus pushes the boulder up the hill every day only to have it roll back down again. And he pushes it back up and he has it roll back down. Now, of course, this in reality would be so disheartening, it would be a slog, because we also need forward movement and to get to a sense that we're achieving things. That's the masculine principled polarity. But it's really showing something of more of the feminine principle. If we imagine that Sisyphus is content with the cycle of his life, that every day he's going to do these same routines, just like every year it's going to be spring, summer, fall, winter, and then spring again. And just like every morning we're going to be brushing our teeth, and every morning, the day cycle is going to be, let's say the day is going to be turning into night. All of these cycles are going to happen, and they're not about going anywhere. They're not about achieving something. So Sisyphus pushing the boulder up the hill isn't about him actually getting the boulder up over the hill. It's about engaging in the process. It's not about the product of his work, which is in the more masculine principled polarity. It's about the process of his work. And so if you can imagine him contented with engaging in the process that doesn't really go anywhere, then you start to be able to understand how to integrate the feminine principled polarity of cycles. All right, the next quality of the feminine that I'll be discussing is emotion, with its masculine counterpart of thought. So thought is something that's very intellectual in nature. It's something that's happening in the mind. Now, emotion is a more body-based phenomenon. So I had mentioned earlier that the body and the instincts are associated with the feminine, where the mind is associated with the masculine. So this tracks on with that. This kind of dovetails off of that. So basically, if we're in connection to the body and with the emotions are a carrier of wisdom and a carrier of our intuition. And if we're connected to our muscle memory and all of the things that are happening there in our body, there's a kind of information, a kind of knowledge that our body can communicate to us. And it's a different type of knowing than happens in the mind. And so if we tend to think about the mind as being the dominant thing when it comes to figuring things out or getting some kind of wisdom, we might look at things as like, oh, every bit of inner work that I do has to like end in some kind of an insight that the mind can logically think of. But when it comes to, let's say, getting in connection to the body, there's a kind of knowing that the body has, a kind of instinctual wisdom. And so if we're able to tune into that, we can get into connection with the wisdom of the body, which is always communicating to us. But if we're in resistance to our emotions, if we see our emotions as something that's just a hindrance, or that, oh, if we have these emotions, we're too sensitive, or we push them away in any way, then we don't get access to that wisdom. And so if you have any type of beliefs that emotions are something that need to be gotten rid of, then you would be leaving quite a lot of wisdom off of the table. All right, the next feminine principled quality to drop resistance to is darkness, with its masculine principled counterpart, the light. So when it comes to darkness, if we think about it in the sense of night and day, so the daytime, everything is bright, everything is clear. When it's dark, when it's in the nighttime, everything is kind of mysterious. But then there's also this kind of renewing energy that's there within the nighttime. So we rest in the nighttime, when we can kind of rejuvenate ourselves. So the darkness actually has a rejuvenating kind of quality. And it's also a lot more still, a lot more calm in the nighttime than it is during the daytime. So basically the masculine tends to be associated with things that are very energetic, very high energy, whereas the feminine is kind of like a kind of calmer, lower energy. So yin energy tends to be this way. Now, that's one angle to look at darkness through. Another angle is to look at it through the parts of ourselves that we don't want to see. So the shadow is in this way within the feminine principle. So oftentimes we want to see the parts of ourself that we've labeled as good and identify with those parts and push away the parts of ourself that we've labeled as bad. So we come into resistance with our dark side, and what happens is we start to repress those elements, and then they start to take on more monstrous forms that push us into negative directions. But if we can look directly toward our shadow and we can start to integrate those elements of ourselves, then we can come to actually have more healthy expressions where we're able to, let's say, see the good in the parts of ourself that we would typically label as bad. Now, if we have a resistance to that which is in the polarity of darkness, the feminine principled polarity of darkness, what's going to happen is that we're going to polarize away from it, and then those things will actually influence us from underneath the surface of consciousness. So if you have resistance to your dark side or your bad side or whatever you want to label it, ultimately you want to be able to look into the unconscious, which is also feminine principled. The conscious mind's masculine, the unconscious is feminine, and to be able to connect with those elements of yourself that you've repressed or denied or rejected. Right, now the last feminine principle quality that I'll be talking about in this video is contraction, with its masculine principled counterpoint, expansion. And so expansion is something that we have a tendency to see in a very positive light, whenever we're growing, whenever we're expanding, whereas contraction, we tend to think about it as something that's stifling or something that's stagnating, and certainly in its negative perspective, that can be the case. But in the same way that, like, let's say there's limitation and unlimitedness, ultimately, when it comes to contraction, what it does is it has to do with drawing us back down to earth, drawing us back down to what's limited. And oftentimes it has to do with kind of trimming the fat of what's unnecessary. So if we kind of conceptualize of our life as something that's meant to expand infinitely, and yet our body is finite, what's going to happen is that we're going to come out of alignment with our body. So ultimately, if I think about myself as always growing, always expanding, then my physical form isn't really going to be able to handle that. And eventually that physical form is going to contract me, is going to bring me back down to earth. Now, if I decide to do this consciously, to be able to appreciate my limits and to appreciate, let's say, the limitations of my life, ultimately, then I can start to put down roots. So basically, the feminine has a lot to do with rooting and groundedness and limitation. And so in that connection to that which is earthy, it sort of brings our more abstract, kind of imaginal world back into alignment with this world, the world of form. So it's sort of a way to marry the abstract and imaginal with the actual and the real. So if we're able to connect things back down to that which is limited, that which is earthy, that which is physical, we actually get a lot more positive things that come about through the marriage of expansion and contraction in that way. So for example, if I have tons and tons of really lofty ideas and all sorts of creative insights coming up, well, ultimately, in order to manifest that into form, I have to be able to contract it down into some form that's possible here in the world. So for example, if I have like all of these ideas about, like, let's say I'm an architect and I want to design a building, and I have all these lofty ideas, well, ultimately I have to square that with the physical reality of building a building. I still have to make sure that it matches up to all the building codes, and I have to make sure that it's going to be structurally sound. I can't actually be very fast and loose about that, because ultimately the things that are in my mind have to be contracted down into a form that the earth, basically the laws of physics and that which is earthy are in alignment with. So oftentimes contraction can be something that roots us back down into the reality of things and helps us make our more imaginal world into something real. So we take that which is expansive and abstract and we contract it down into something that's physical and real. So in this way, the masculine principled path is one that's about overcoming obstacles and continuing to grow and expand, whereas the feminine principled path is one of contraction and accepting what is. So let's say, for example, that there's a person that's overweight and this person decides to go on the masculine principled path. So that's like, okay, let me overcome my discomforts and let's say, bring myself into a space where I lose that weight and I get into good shape. So that's the masculine principled path. The feminine principled path is saying, can I accept myself as I am? Can I, let's say, be overweight and still love myself and still connect with myself and still be okay with myself? And so one is about, let's actually go through the process of like fixing things, and the other is about accepting things. So that acceptance is a contraction, whereas the fixing things often requires a lot of expansion. And so not just to say either one of these paths are good or bad, but if we've polarized into one or the other, we might want to connect with the other side. Or let's say if, for example, I'm on some kind of healing journey, and shadow work can be a good place to bring this into, because we can have both of these motivations. So let's say if I think about shadow work in the sense that, okay, I'm going to overcome all the traumas that I experienced, and I'm going to continue to expand and grow and this type of thing. Whereas the feminine principled path is, can I accept all of these aspects within myself? Can I accept the good, the bad, and the ugly? Can I accept myself the way that I am without thinking that it's going to change in some way, or that I'm going to grow past it, or I'm going to fix myself in some way? So when it comes to contraction, it's all about being able to pare things down to what is without expecting for things to change and grow and to overcome whatever barriers are there. Now, with all 11 of these feminine qualities on the list and their masculine counterparts, what you want to do is you want to be looking at any sense of grasping and aversion toward any of these qualities. So if you find yourself grasping onto something in the feminine principle or the masculine principle and saying, oh, I really want to identify with this, and like, oh, yes, I'm glad that's associated with, let's say, my energy or whatever it happens to be, that's something to watch out for. The other thing is to watch out for any type of resistances that we might have. So for example, if there's a resistance to limitations and endings, or if there is, let's say, a confusion or something around, let's say, something like being, and it's like, okay, well, how can something be valuable if it isn't doing anything? So if you notice anything like this, any type of like objections, those are a sign of resistance to those feminine principled qualities. And ultimately what you'll want to do is you want to be able to figure out what the root of those resistances are. And so you can basically start to contemplate into any of these polarities and to start trying to connect with whatever they represent. So for example, if you find yourself polarizing into doing to the exclusion of being, it's sort of like, well, if you think about your life in some way that's separate from the things that you're doing, what's the value of your life? Do you feel like your life is still valid if you're not achieving living and doing the things that you want to do? And if not, then like, why is that? And start to question into your, let's say, deeply taken for granted, let's say, notions about the way the world works. And that can help you get more in touch with those feminine principled aspects. Now, this is by no means an exhaustive list of feminine principled qualities. I have a video that I made a long time back, on masculinity, femininity, and authenticity. That was like almost like right at the beginning of the channel. So you can check that one out. I also have a few other ones about the masculine and feminine if you want to check those out. And I'll do more videos like this in the future, including the one about masculine principled qualities. Anyway, so that's all I have for you for now. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, go ahead and click the like button below and subscribe and leave me a comment down below. And if you would like to learn about shadow work, I have a free 60-minute shadow integration masterclass called the 6 Simple Steps to Shadow Integration. And if you want to check that out, you can go to shadowintegration.org/masterclass. And until next time, keep becoming more you.